28 soldiers, one radio tower, a storm that wanted them all dead. The enemy had them surrounded on three sides, artillery walking closer with every volley, and their only marksman was somewhere in the mud with a bullet in his chest. Captain Elias Ward had 30 seconds to find a solution before the kill zone became a graveyard. That's when the supply clerk opened a case nobody knew she was carrying. What came out of that case would rewrite everything those soldiers thought they knew about the quiet woman who'd been hauling ration crates for 4 days. If this kind of story hits different for you, subscribe right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit like, stay until the end. The rain came sideways at Blackstone Ridge. Not the cinematic kind. Not the slow, moody drizzle that makes things look dramatic in low light. This was freezing mountain rain, and that gets under your collar in the first 30 seconds and stays there for hours. That turns clay soil into grease and makes rifle optics fog at the worst possible moment. The kind that drops morale faster than incoming fire. Because at least incoming fire is something you can shoot back at. Private Mara Voss had been awake for 31 hours. She'd stopped counting after 26, started again when the first artillery round hit the vehicle checkpoint at the eastern approach and turned a concrete wall into a debris field. Now she was crouched behind what remained of that wall, holding a crate of 5.56 ammunition against her chest with both arms, listening to the firefight evolve around her the way a navigator listens to weather not for comfort, but for information. She'd been with Echo Company for 4 days. 4 days of carrying supplies, learning the layout of the forward position, figuring out which soldiers were the ones to watch and which ones were the ones to avoid. She hadn't volunteered opinions, hadn't pushed herself into conversations. When someone handed her a task, she completed it without commentary and moved on to the next one. In a unit as loud and tight-knit and territorial as Echo Company, that made her invisible. A moving piece of furniture, someone you'd remember only when you needed something carried. She was good at that. She'd spent years practicing it. Voss. Corporal Dietrich had learned her name on day 2, which put him ahead of most of the platoon. He was a stocky man from somewhere in the Midwest Ohio, she thought, though she hadn't asked, with a habit of chewing the same corner of his lower lip when he was thinking hard. He was thinking hard a lot tonight. You got that 5.56 from the rear vehicle? Already staged it behind the second berm, she said. I left the 7.62 in place. Figured you'd want it closer to Martinez's position. He stared at her. I just asked you 40 seconds ago. I move fast when things are loud. He gave her the look she'd gotten from people her whole life, that flicker of reassessment, there and gone, replaced immediately by the next problem. People always had a next problem. It was the most reliable thing about them. Good thinking on the 7.62, he said, already turning away. She watched him go. Didn't say anything. That was fine. The contact had started at 2,140. What battalion intelligence had assessed as a reinforced company in the area turned out to be something considerably larger, a full battalion with armored vehicle support, 2 heavy machine gun emplacements, a mortar crew running a coordinated suppression pattern, and an enemy commander who clearly knew what he was doing. Someone's source was either dead or compromised. In the immediate term, it didn't matter which. Echo Company had 28 personnel present for duty. 28 against an estimated force, now placing well over 200 in the engagement zone, with more potentially moving through the valley to the south. The math was not encouraging. The communications vehicle had been destroyed at 2,204, an IED triggered remotely, taking out their primary radio capability in a single event that felt too well timed to be coincidental. The backup handhelds were getting eaten alive by jamming. They had sporadic comms enough to push a distress transmission to higher, not enough to coordinate a meaningful response. QRF was somewhere on the other side of terrain that was currently being actively contested. Ammunition was running short. The eastern berm had burned through nearly 40% of its combat load in the first hour of the fight. The mortar crew on the southeast slope was walking rounds closer to the perimeter, with each adjustment methodical, unhurried, the work of someone who understood suppression and wasn't in a rush. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since sundowns, and Sergeant First Class Cole Echo Company's designated marksman, the unit's only long-range precision shooter, the man whose presence on the roster was supposed to be the answer to exactly. This kind of scenario was sitting behind the checkpoint wall with a tourniquet on his left arm and a face the color of old wax. A ricochet fragment, upper arm. The bone was broken badly enough that he'd known it immediately, not from the pain, which was considerable, but from the wrong sound his arm made when it happened. He was right-handed, which meant he technically could still shoot, and he'd told Ward this, and Ward had looked at the arm and then at Cole's face and said no. Cole had not argued. He hated that he hadn't argued, but he hadn't. He knew what he looked like. Captain Elias Ward moved along the defensive line in the rain, checking positions, talking to his people in the compressed shorthand of someone for whom every extra word is a waste. 11 years in uniform, multiple deployments. He'd seen bad nights before. He knew what they felt like from the inside, the specific quality of a situation that has moved from difficult to genuinely dangerous to we need something to change right now. This night had cleared all three. He crouched beside Martinez at the eastern berm. The specialist had a belt-fed weapon and the expression of a man rationing rounds in his head with every trigger pull. What are you working with? 300, maybe 350 if Reyes can. Martinez paused to fire a controlled burst. 3 rounds. Target he'd been tracking across the open slope. If Reyes can get me the spare box from the rear vehicle. Already staged, Mara's voice came from somewhere behind Ward's left shoulder. He turned. She was moving past him in a low crouch, carrying the spare ammunition box with both hands, heading for Martinez's position without being directed. Ward watched her set it down. Watched Martinez look up with the instinctive gratitude of a man who'd been about to run dry, watched her turn and move back to her own position without waiting for acknowledgement. Efficient. Quiet. Already thinking 2 steps ahead. He filed it away and kept moving. At the northwest corner, he found Trevino managing a 3-man element with a gap in their coverage that was starting to worry him. At the south wall, he found his medic working on a soldier who'd taken shrapnel across the forearm, painful, not critical. Everywhere he went, the situation was the same. Holding, but barely, and the verb was getting harder to maintain. Cole was at the checkpoint structure when Ward came back around. He'd moved himself to a position where he could at least observe the eastern approach, couldn't shoot, but couldn't stand not being useful either. Ward understood that. It was the same impulse that made people stupid in firefights. "I'm sorry," Cole said, before Ward could say anything. "You got hit." Still, Ward looked at his marksman for 1 second, then looked away. He needed reach. He needed someone who could touch the enemy's leadership at range, the vehicle, the commanders, the mortar crew, the machine gun team on the northeast slope. Without that capability, they were going to get pressed from every direction simultaneously until the perimeter collapsed. He raised his voice. Not quite a shout. Controlled broadcast, the kind that carries. "Where is our marksman?" The firefight didn't pause. The rain didn't pause, but along Echo Company's defensive line, the soldiers who weren't actively engaged turned their heads or registered the question in some peripheral way, and the answer that came back was silence. The kind of silence that means there isn't one. Then movement at the western corner. Mara Voss stood up from behind the shattered abutment. She was carrying her standard issue pack on her back and a separate rucksack over her left shoulder, the one Ward hadn't seen before, the one she'd kept positioned against the interior wall of the checkpoint structure in a way that looked incidental, that no one had thought to ask about. She walked to the center of the defensive perimeter without hurrying, set the rucksack on a flat section of broken concrete, and unzipped it. The rifle came out in components. Ward had been in the army long enough to recognize what he was looking at, even before she finished assembling it. Precision bolt action, heavy barrel, suppressor-ready muzzle device, carbon fiber stock, with a matte, anti-reflective finish on every surface. The scope was a Nightforce ATACR, the kind of optic that costs more than a vehicle and that you do not buy at a gun shop. The turret had hand-labeled tape markings in a notation system Ward didn't immediately recognize. She assembled it from components in the dark, in the rain, with her hands moving from memory. No hesitation at any connection point. No fumbling with the bolt. No pause to check her work. 38 seconds from the first component out of the pack to a fully assembled, chambered weapon. She moved to the checkpoint corner, stacked 2 concrete blocks with her foot, without looking away from the ridge, got into position, and settled the rifle. She breathed in, let half of it out, put her eye to the scope. The soldiers closest to her had stopped shooting. Not because the firefight had paused, it hadn't, but because there's a gravity to certain things that pulls attention toward them, whether you want it pulled or not. Something about the way she moved. Something about the rifle. Something about the complete absence of any visible doubt in anything she did. Someone started. Nobody finished this sentence. Ward moved to her position. He needed information. He also needed to not take too long getting it. Boss. Sir. She didn't look up from the scope. That rifle. Mine. That's not an issue property book item. No, sir, it's not. Voss Captain, she said it quietly, without inflection. That mortar crew on the southeast slope is going to drop their next adjustment round onto your eastern berm in somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. I've been tracking their firing intervals. They're walking it in and they're close. A pause. She made a small adjustment to the elevation dial. 1 click, maybe 2. I'd like to be in position before that. Ward looked at her. At the rifle. At the ridge. Short version, he said. Who are you? Someone who can help you right now. She finally looked at him briefly, directly, with eyes that were doing the same kind of environmental calculation the scope was doing. Everything else can wait. It was not the answer. It was the only answer available. Do it, Ward said. The first shot came 17 seconds later. Mara had spent most of those 70 seconds doing something that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing, lying completely still, cheek welded to the stock, watching through the scope. Her breathing was controlled to the point of seeming too slow for a human being in a combat environment. One of the newer soldiers, Private Hendricks, 19 years old, 3 months in uniform, watched her from 6 feet away and felt a superstitious chill he wouldn't admit to for years afterward. She fired. The 0.5 BMG report was a physical event. Not a sound, a pressure change, a concussive crack that pushed against eardrums and rattled loose debris on the checkpoint wall and made 3 soldiers in the immediate area flinch. So hard, they broke their sight pictures. Suppressors manage acoustic signature from a distance. At the source at 0.5 caliber, there's no managing it. 920 yards downrange in a hide that the enemy sniper had constructed carefully and maintained patiently for the better part of 2 hours, the man who had been making Echo Company's eastern position extremely dangerous ceased to be a problem. Ward had his binos up. He watched it happen. He said nothing. The second shot came 53 seconds later. In that 53 seconds, Mara had moved 3 feet to her left, adjusted her scope elevation, compensated for a wind shift she'd read from the movement of a small debris flag she'd positioned at the berm 20 minutes before anyone knew to watch for it, and settled back into position for a different target. The heavy machine gun on the northeast slope. She'd been tracking the crew's movement pattern since before the rifle was assembled, building a picture of their rhythm when they shifted, when they paused, when the gunner handed the weapon to the A-gunner and stepped away. She waited for the transition moment, that 2-second window of mechanical exchange when the gun wasn't firing and both hands were occupied, and she took the shot. The machine gun went silent. Corporal Dietrich, Ohio accent and bitten lip, and the first person to learn her name, was 50 feet away when this happened. He was watching. He would later describe the 53 seconds between the first and second shot as the longest he'd ever experienced in a firefight, which was saying something, because he'd been in several. He would also say, when pushed to explain what he meant, she didn't look like she was trying. That was the thing. She looked like she was waiting for something she already knew was going to happen. The mortar crew was harder. Good indirect fire crews move after every third or fourth round. It's doctrine, discipline. The difference between experienced crews and the ones who don't make it through their second month. This crew was good. They'd been shifting position between fire missions, beans, throughout the engagement, never staying anywhere long enough to establish a pattern. Except they said established a pattern. It was just a longer one than the obvious interval. Mara had been tracking it. She fired once. The round struck close, but didn't solve the problem. She worked the bolt without visible frustration, made a correction a small one, barely perceptible to anyone watching, and fired again. The mortar went quiet. Someone on the defensive line said, in a voice stripped completely of its usual register, "Jesus." Then she identified the commander. This was the part that Cole would talk about later. When he was physically capable of talking from his position against the checkpoint wall, tourniquet, arm immobilized, he'd had a different angle than most of the others. And what he'd watched was something he'd spent years trying and failing to describe. The enemy officer was at a covered position behind two armored vehicles, deeper in the engagement zone than the forward elements, visible only in brief intervals when vehicles shifted and sight lines opened. Most people would not have identified him as command. He'd been smart about it. No visible rank, no radio in hand, positioned to look like anyone. Mara identified him by the way other people moved around him. She told Ward this afterward, in the flat tone of someone explaining a process they consider straightforward. Authority creates a bubble. People lean slightly toward it or away from it without realizing. You learn to read the bubble, not the person. She took the shot during a burst of covering fire from Echo Company's Eastern Element, using the noise to mask her muzzle signature. The officer went down. Then the communications team, two men identified by the antenna equipment they couldn't fully conceal. Each shot was a separate calculation: range, wind, temperature, slope angle, humidity. She ran the numbers in a way that was partly mathematics and partly something that lives below mathematics, the physical grammar of long-range precision shooting, learned through enough repetition that it stops being conscious and becomes something closer to instinct, wearing the clothes of technique. She moved between positions after every 2 shots. Never the same spot, twice in the same sequence. She used noise from the ongoing firefight to cover her movements, shifting only when weapons were firing and going completely still when the battlefield briefly quieted. She was managing her signature the way a musician manages sound, aware of everything else that was happening, working with it rather than against it. Cole watched all of it and felt the complicated humility of someone watching a person do the thing they thought they did best and discovering what best actually looks like. 38 minutes into the engagement, Echo Company's situation had changed. Not solved, changed. The enemy's command structure had a hole in it. Their mortar support was gone. Their best machine gun position was neutralized. Their communications chain had developed a significant gap. The pressure on the perimeter dropped from "this is ending badly" to "this is still bad but manageable," which in a firefight is a meaningful distinction. Ward found Mara during the pause, when the enemy fire had dropped to probing contact, cautious, disorganized, the sound of a force recalibrating. "I need answers," he said. Now. She was scanning the ridge through the scope, prone behind a low berm she'd selected, and occupied without instruction. She didn't look up. "Private Mara Voss," she said. "Echo Company. Logistics element. Mara, sir, stop." She looked at him. The professionalism was still. There it was always there. It was apparently structural, but underneath it, something older. Something that looked like it had been carrying weight for a long time and had gotten good at not showing the strain. Nightglass, she said quietly. Ward had heard the name once. A secure briefing 18 months prior, mentioned as a footnote, then actively walked back by the briefer, the kind of retraction that tells you exactly how real something is. Long-range interdiction, high-value target removal, operated without footprint, without attribution, without anything that connected to conventional military structure. 7 years, she said before he asked. I was in for 7 years. Why aren't you still in? The rain fell between them for a moment. I requested ordinary duty, she said. They weren't happy. They accommodated me. Why? She looked back through the scope. Ask me after. The respite lasted 17 minutes. Trevino saw at first shadows in the southeastern tree line, moving with purpose, not the random motion of wind and debris. He grabbed Ward's sleeve and pointed. Mara had already repositioned. 4 countersnipers, pulled from reserve, brought in specifically because the enemy had identified the problem they were dealing with, and they intended to solve it with a mirror. It was the correct professional response. 4 precision shooters, 4 different quadrants, working in coordinated pairs. Ward moved to her. How bad? Bad, she said, without any particular emotion in it. 4 of them, different positions. They've been setting up for about 8 minutes. I tracked the first one moving during the lull. She was still watching the ridge. Her breathing was the same as it had been, before the first shot, slower than it should have been, deeper, controlled at some level below active thought. They'll work pairs. First pair draws my muzzle signature. Second pair uses it to range me and take the shot. It's a good system. What do you need? 12 minutes. Cover my position. Don't engage the southeast quadrant unless you're directly threatened. I need the sightlines open. To do what? She paused. Just for a moment. Something that probably won't work perfectly, she said. But better than the alternative. Ward looked at her. She was already looking at the ridge. 12 minutes, he said, and went back to his line. What followed, none of the soldiers present would be able to fully reconstruct. They saw her move materials, sandbags, debris, a section of metal conduit from the damaged checkpoint structure. They saw her rig what looked like a positioning stake from a broken cleaning rod and place her patrol cap on it at an angle that looked almost casual. They saw her shift twice to different spots within the western corner area, each time settling in with the same unhurried deliberateness, scanning, adjusting, lying still. Then she went completely quiet for 4 minutes and 50 seconds. The enemy teams were patient. They didn't bite on the first hint of movement. They were waiting for commitment, for a shot, for something that anchored her real position beyond doubt. Good doctrine. These were not amateurs. She gave them 4 minutes and 50 seconds of nothing. Then she gave them the patrol cap. A cord thin enough to be invisible at distance in the rain, rigged to create a specific type of movement, not random, not mechanical, but the particular micro-shift of something that might be a head-adjusting position behind cover. 3 inches. A pause. 2 inches the other direction. The shot came from the southeast, cracking into the sandbag 6 inches from the decoy. In the same breath, not after, not in response, but simultaneous, because she'd been waiting for this exact moment and had pre-positioned for it. Mara fired at the location she'd identified as the first shooter's hide. The second enemy shooter, the backup, the rangefinder, fired at her primary position a half-second later. Hit nothing, because she'd moved the moment her trigger broke, rolling left while the rifle was sim-still in her hands, not stopping until she was behind a different section of the berm. She worked the bolt. She used the noise of the ongoing firefight to mask 2 more repositions, moving only during weapons fire, freezing during the pauses, reading the rhythm of the engagement the way a person reads traffic before crossing a busy street. She was inside a pattern she'd built in her head over the previous 20 minutes. The enemy teams had one. She'd mapped it. She was using it. 3 more shots. 4 minutes total, start to finish. When it ended, the southeast quadrant was silent. Ward stood at the checkpoint structure and looked at what she'd built. The sandbag pile, the patrol cap on its wire, the firing positions, each occupied once. Simple some concept, precise in execution. The kind of thing that looks obvious in retrospect and would have gotten anyone less practiced killed in the attempt. Nearby, fragments of conversation, 4 of them, all 4. She never even, did you see how she moved between? Then Specialist Ruiz, who'd spent 2 years attached to an intelligence element before a transfer request that nobody had asked him to explain, went quiet in a way that was different from the others. He was looking at the rifle, specifically at the stock, at the worn patch near the cheek rest where years of use had rubbed the finish thin. At something scratched there, barely legible. 2 letters. M.V. Ruiz had heard things he wasn't supposed to hear. In intelligence work, that was a job hazard. One of the things he'd heard in a conversation he was behind a partition for during a briefing he'd been scheduled to leave 30 seconds earlier was a name. Attached to a capability rating he'd never heard applied to a living person. He looked from the initials to Mara, who was 60 feet away systematically, breaking down her position in the rain, moving with the same unhurried efficiency she'd shown doing supply runs on her first day. "That's Mara Voss," Ruiz said quietly, just to the soldiers immediately around him. The Ghost of Nightglass. Several people looked at him. Several more looked at her. She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving. If she'd heard, she gave nothing. Dietrich Corporal, Dietrich, Ohio, bitten lip, the first to learn her name. The man who'd noted that she moved fast and filed it away as a minor interesting fact about a supply clerk, stood with his rifle loose in his hands, and felt the particular vertigo of realizing that the category you put someone in was the wrong one. That you'd been watching a thing without seeing it. 4 days, he said. Yeah, Ruiz said. She carried ammunition crates. Yeah. Nobody had anything to add to that. Ward, watching from the checkpoint doorway, watched Mara finish packing, lift the rifle by the grip, and stand. She looked up at the sky not the way people look up to check weather, but the way they look up when they're thinking something they don't want on their face. Whatever she was calculating, she kept it. But Ward had spent 11 years reading people. It was the skill that had kept him effective when everything else was failing. And what he was reading in Mara Voss, in the set of her shoulders and the direction of her eyes, and the quality of the stillness that surrounded her, even in the middle of a firefight, wasn't relief that the counter-snipers were gone. Wasn't the professional satisfaction of work completed. It was the look of someone who had already moved past the current problem, who was already at the next position, in her head, standing at the base of something steep and necessary and almost certainly very bad, and who had already decided to climb it. Ward stared at the ridge, at the dark beyond the ridge, at the distant diesel growl of vehicles moving through the valley, engines unmuffled, not bothering to hide their approach. His stomach went cold. They weren't finished. They were barely started. Whatever had come before the first firefight. The counter-snipers, the 70 minutes of holding the line, had been the opening act of something considerably larger. He could hear it coming. And so he was certain, could she. The vehicles were running without lights. Ward heard them before he saw them, that low, rolling diesel sound that carries differently than anything else in a mountain environment, bouncing off ridgelines in a way that makes range estimation difficult and direction estimation worse. He counted engine signatures, at least 4, maybe 6, moving through the valley below the southern approach, with the unhurried confidence of a force that knew exactly where it was going and had already decided the outcome. He turned from the ridge and raised his voice. Trevino. South wall. Now. Trevino was already moving, Ward crossed the perimeter to where Mara was finishing her breakdown, still carrying the rifle, still reading the skyline the way she'd been reading it since the counter-snipers went quiet. He stopped beside her and didn't bother with preamble. South approach. Armor. How many can you make from here? She was quiet for 4 seconds, not hesitating processing. There was a difference, and Ward was starting to learn it. From this position, nothing useful. The slope blocks the valley floor until there's inside 800 meters. She looked at the ridge to the southeast, then at the checkpoint structure, then back at him. I need higher ground. The ridge is exposed. Yes. Counter-sniper threat is neutralized for now. That changes when their command element reorganizes and figures out what happened. I know. How long do you need on the high ground before that becomes a problem? She thought about it, honestly. That was the thing about her. She didn't give optimistic answers to make the situation sound manageable. She gave the answer she actually believed. Depends how fast their comms are running. 15 minutes before someone starts asking where their precision teams are. Another 10 before they redirect assets. She paused. 20 minutes. After that, I'm working against active counterfire, and the math gets worse. Ward looked at the ridge, at the darkness beyond it, at the woman standing beside him with a rifle that shouldn't exist, giving him a timeline that was tighter than he wanted and more honest than most people would have offered. You go up there and you're the highest visible object on the entire ridgeline, he said. I know that too. Mara, Captain? She said it the same way she'd said it the first time, quiet, level, without aggression, but with a finality that didn't leave much room. You've got 28 people in this perimeter. What they're bringing up from the south is going to hit the western approach hardest, because that's where your coverage is thinnest. I've been watching the terrain for 4 days. They've been watching it longer. She checked the rifle's action without looking down at it, muscle memory, a habit so old it wasn't a thought anymore. I can disrupt their approach timing from the ridge. Give your people a window to reposition. Or you draw every gun they have. Or that, she agreed. That's also possible. Ward stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them was pretending this was a conversation with a good outcome available. It was a conversation between two people trying to find the least bad one. You do not engage until I give the word, he said. You get up there, you establish position, you wait for my call. Understood. And you come back down. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, not agreement, not refusal, something in between that bothered him more than either. Then she turned and moved toward the ridge. Sergeant First Class Cole had dragged himself to a sitting position against the eastern wall, tourniquet arm across his chest, watching the south approach through the gap in the checkpoint structure. He couldn't do much. He was doing what he could. When Mara passed him on her way to the ridge, he said her name. She stopped. He'd been thinking about what to say since Ruiz dropped the name 20 minutes ago. He was a deliberate man by nature, not slow, but careful, the kind of person who preferred to understand something fully before commenting on it. He'd been turning the name over in his head, the way you turn a rock over to see what's underneath. Nightglass, he said. She looked at him, not alarmed, not defensive, just careful. You know it, she said. Heard it once. Briefing. Guy said the name, and then the next sentence was, disregard that, which is the military way of saying, remember it forever. He shifted against the wall, and the movement cost him something. His face tightened briefly before he got it back. 7 years? 7. That's a long time to be a ghost. She was quiet for a moment. It is. What happened? The thing that made you request out. She looked at the ridge, then back at him. Cole was the kind of person who asked a question and then waited for the actual answer, not the deflection, not the short version, the answer. It was in the way he held the silence afterward. Patient, not aggressive, just present. 3 years ago, she said, we had a high-value target, senior logistics officer for an enemy network, the kind of target that would have disrupted their supply chain for months. We had him in a vehicle, moving through a checkpoint area. She paused, reorganized something in her face. I had the shot. Confirmed target, confirmed vehicle, wind read, distance dialed. Everything clean. Cole waited. I hesitated, she said. 3 seconds, maybe 4. I don't know why I've thought about it every day since, and I still don't have a clean answer. Something in my chest locked up. She looked at her hands, then stopped looking. The vehicle accelerated. He was gone. 12 hours later, a supply convoy got hit with information from his network. 2 soldiers died. The rain fell between them. Cole didn't say anything immediately, which was the right instinct. 2 of my people, she said. People I'd worked with. And I had him. I had the shot. You don't know the convoy hit was connected? No, I don't know it for certain, she said it flatly. I know it well enough. Cole looked at her for a long moment. The tourniquet arm shifted slightly, and he absorbed whatever that cost him without showing it. So you requested ordinary duty, he said, because you didn't trust yourself with the rifle anymore. She didn't answer. Which was the answer? And then tonight. Tonight was different, she said. Tonight it wasn't one target. It was 28 people who die if I don't. She picked up the rifle from where she'd leaned it against the wall. That's a different kind of math. She moved toward the ridge before he could say anything else. Cole watched her go. He sat there against the wall with his broken arm and his depleted adrenaline and the cold rain coming through the gap in the structure. And he thought about the difference between guilt and consequences, and whether 3 seconds of hesitation 3 years ago had anything to do with the woman he just watched counter-snipers part 4 counter-snipers part like they were a practice problem. He didn't arrive at a conclusion. Some things don't resolve that cleanly. The ridge was worse than it looked from below. That was always the way. Terrain reads differently on a map. From a distance, from ground level, you plan for one thing and find another. The slope was steeper than the angle suggested from the perimeter, the footing worse, the exposed sections longer. Mara moved in short rushes between whatever cover was available, a collapsed section of old retaining wall, a boulder that predated everything else up here by several geological eras, a shallow depression that offered maybe 18 inches of profile reduction. She reached the crest in 11 minutes, faster than she'd planned for, which meant she'd pushed harder than was smart, which meant her breathing was elevated and her hands were less steady than she wanted. She gave herself 90 seconds at the base of the ridge crest, just lying there, letting her system come back down, making no movement that would skyline her. The valley opened below. Even in the dark, even in the rain, she could see them. 3 armored vehicles running blacked out on the valley floor, 2 troop carriers behind them, infantry moving on foot to the east of the vehicle column, where the terrain offered more concealment. They'd spread the formation, not bunched up the way an inexperienced force might, not clustered around the vehicles for psychological comfort. Spread out and moving with purpose. Someone down there knew what they were doing. She keyed her radio. Static mostly, with the jamming still active, but she got a partial connection. Actual. Voss. I'm in position. South approach, 5 vehicles, infantry element to the east. Estimate 60 plus on foot. They're going to hit the western approach in approximately 12 minutes. Ward's voice came back broken but legible. Confirmed. Hold position. Holding. She settled behind the scope. The vehicle commanders were the priority. She'd identified that, immediately. Armored vehicles without command direction become significantly less coordinated. The infantry was dangerous, but manageable for Echo Company's defensive line if they weren't being orchestrated from above. Remove the orchestration, and the approach falls apart into components that Ward's people could handle. She found the first vehicle commander. He was using a hatch position, head and shoulders exposed, moving between his vehicle optics and a manual scan of the terrain ahead. Professional habit. Kept him informed, kept him alive most of the time. She ranged him. 840 meters. Crosswind from the northeast, moderate. The slope introduced a downward angle that compressed the effective trajectory she'd need to adjust for that. She waited for Ward's call. The vehicles kept moving. The infantry kept moving. The 12-minute window she'd estimated was now a 10-minute window, which was fine, which was still workable, which was not a problem yet. A hand touched her left ankle. She didn't fire, which was something, but she moved, fast, rolling, left with the rifle, putting space between herself and the contact before her brain had finished processing the input. She came up behind the boulder with the rifle angled low, ready, before she registered the uniform. Private Hendricks, 19 years old. The one who'd watched her from 6 feet away during the first engagement with the expression of someone watching something they couldn't categorize. He was breathing hard from the climb. He had his rifle and a second ammunition pouch that he'd clearly brought as an offering. He held it up like that, explained everything. Captain said, he started. He didn't, she said. He said, make sure you had what you needed. He didn't say that. Hendricks opened his mouth, closed it. He was a bad liar, which was actually a good quality in a soldier, but wasn't helping him right now. You followed me up, she said. It wasn't a question. You didn't have a spotter. I don't need a spotter. Everyone needs a Hendricks. She said his name the way Ward said hers, not loud, not aggressive, just with enough weight to stop the sentence. If I have to manage you while I'm working, you become a liability. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He looked at the valley, at the vehicles, at the scope, then back at her. Tell me what to do, he said. I'll do exactly that and nothing else. She looked at him for a long moment. His hands were steady enough. He wasn't panicking. He'd climbed a ridge in a firefight in the dark because he thought she needed backup, which was either courage or stupidity, and the line between those two things depended mostly on the outcome. Left side of that boulder, she said. You watch the east slope. Enemy infantry is moving through there. You see movement below the ridge line, coming up toward us, you tell me. That's it. That's your entire job. Okay. You do not fire unless they are within 50 meters. If you fire, you give our position. Okay. If I tell you to move, you move immediately, no questions. She turned back to the scope. Behind her, she heard him settle into position against the left side of the boulder, careful, not scraping the rock, moving quietly. She noted it without comment. Ward's voice cracked through the radio. Voss, western approach. They're splitting the column. She'd seen it in the scope half a second. Before he said it, the vehicle formation diverging, one element swinging wider to approach from the southwest, where Echo Company's coverage had a natural gap. Smart. Someone down there had either done reconnaissance or had good maps. I see it, she said. Ready when you are. Take the shot. The first round hit the lead vehicle's commander at 850 meters. Not a clean elimination. She'd been honest with herself about that possibility going in, because the vehicle was moving, and moving targets at that range are a different problem from static ones. And she hadn't shot at a moving armored vehicle commander in 14 months. The shot was slightly high, which at that range meant a few inches of real-world deviation from the point of aim. Enough to matter, enough that the man dropped, but not the way she'd intended. She worked the bolt, shifted her aim, took the second shot before the vehicle crew had fully processed what had happened. The vehicle stopped. An armored vehicle that stops becomes a problem for the vehicles behind it. The second carrier in the column had to brake, which disrupted the spacing, which disrupted the timing of the infantry element trying to coordinate with the vehicle advance. 3 seconds of mechanical confusion at the front of a formation does more damage than it sounds like, because everything behind it is moving based on the assumption that the front is doing what it's supposed to be doing. She was already repositioning, moved 4 feet left, got back behind the scope, found the second vehicle's hatch position. The commander had dropped inside learned behavior from the first shot, which meant he was good, but now he was blind, operating on optics alone, which meant his situational awareness had just dropped significantly. She took the third shot at the troop carrier's driver viewport, not to eliminate the driver, but to force him to stop and button up, to remove his ability to see the terrain without electronic assistance. The round struck the viewport frame. The carrier stopped. East slope, Hendricks said behind her. 2 contacts. Coming up the ridge, maybe 200 meters. She'd been in position for 6 minutes. Moving, she said. They moved together, her leading, Hendricks behind her, and to the left, using the ridge crest's broken terrain for cover. She found a shallow depression 40 meters from the boulder, got into position, and ranged the east slope through the scope. Hendricks had been right. 2 figures moving up through the scrub, angling toward the crest. They'd identified the firing position from her muzzle signature, which she'd known would happen and which she'd moved to account for. But they were faster than she'd expected, which meant they'd been moving before she fired. Pericles, which meant they'd anticipated it. She looked at their movement, at their equipment, at the way they were using the terrain. Counter sniper teams. Again, how did they get a team on the east slope that fast, Hendricks said, almost to himself. They didn't. She was already running the timeline backward in her head. They were already up here, staged before the south column moved, which means they expected someone would try this position. She paused. Which means they've been watching us longer than we've been watching them. That landed on Hendricks in a visible way. She didn't have time to let it sit. "Stay behind me and do not fire," she said. The next 4 minutes were not clean. They were the opposite of clean reactive, improvised, working with partial information in terrain she hadn't fully mapped. She moved twice each time using the ridge's natural breaks for cover, each time taking stock of where the enemy team was, relative to where she'd been. They were good. They were moving in a bounding pattern, one stationary, one moving, alternating, which was the right technique for closing on a known sniper position. The problem with bounding movement toward a sniper is that it requires the stationary element to hold still. She found the stationary man first. He was at 210 meter tef behind a section of old terrace wall that had been there long enough to grow moss. His partner was moving somewhere to the north, out of her current sight line. She had one shot at the stationary man before the moving man realized what happened, and the situation changed entirely. She thought about the convoy. She thought about 3 seconds. She fired. The shot connected. The stationary man went down, and before she'd finished processing the confirmation, she was already rolling left, moving, covering 3 meters of ground in a scramble that was not elegant and not quiet, but was fast. And the shot from the moving man came in where she'd been, close enough that she felt the pressure differential of it. She came up behind a broken section of retaining wall, worked the bolt, and waited. The moving man had given himself away with his shot. She had an azimuth. She ranged the area and waited for the micro-movement that always came when a shooter realized his target had moved the instinct to reacquire, to raise the head slightly, to scan. 22 seconds, she fired. Then she was on the radio immediately, moving again while she keyed the handset. Actual Voss. 2 enemy counter-snipers on the East Ridge, eliminated. They were staged pre-attack, which means their command had this position mapped. Expect more coming. The south column is disrupted, but not stopped. Recommend reposition of Western element before they reorganize. Ward came back, copy. Get off the ridge. Working on it. She looked at Hendricks. He was against the retaining wall, rifle in his hands, face doing a complicated thing that was composed of equal parts terror and the specific alertness of someone whose body is committed to a situation their brain hasn't finished deciding about. His hands were shaking slightly. Not badly. Just enough, to be honest. "You did good," she said. "You told me early enough." He looked at her. "You hit both of them." "Yeah, from moving." "While you were moving, you practiced something enough, it starts to feel like the same thing as standing still." She was scanning the ridge as she said it. "Come on. We need to go down." They moved back toward the perimeter in the dark, using the ridge terrain for cover, moving fast but not recklessly. Mara's left knee had taken an impact somewhere during the scramble at the retaining wall. She didn't know when, wasn't sure exactly how bad, and was deliberately not thinking about it because there wasn't anything useful to do about it up here. Hendricks stayed close. He was learning, she noticed. He was watching where she put her feet and replicating it, watching when she paused and pausing with her, calibrating his rhythm to hers. He hadn't been trained to do this. He was doing it by instinct, which said something about him that pure technical proficiency didn't. When they were 3/4 of the way down, he spoke without turning. That name, Ruiz said, Ghost of Nightglass. A pause. Not quite a question. Is that actually what they called you? Some people. Did you like it? She thought about that for a moment. No, she said. Why not? She kept moving. The checkpoint structure was visible below them now, the defensive line's muzzle flashes, marking the western berm where the contact had resumed. Because ghosts are people who didn't make it, she said. I was trying very hard to be something else. Hendricks didn't have a response to that. She hadn't expected one. They came off the ridge at the same point she'd gone up, and Ward was 15 meters inside the perimeter, waiting with the expression of a man who had been watching the ridge and doing and hearing over the radio about what he was hearing over the radio and what it implied about the next 30 minutes. South column, she said, reorganizing. Maybe 8 minutes before they move again. He looked at her knee. She was favoring the left leg. Not dramatically, but enough. You're hurt. It's functional. That's not... It's functional, Captain. He looked at her for a moment, then at Hendricks, who had the appearance of someone who had recently passed through a doorway that he couldn't walk back through, and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. Good work, Ward said to him. She did the work, Hendricks said. You went up. That matters. Ward turned back to the perimeter, already shifting to the next problem, the next position, the next calculation. Voss, I need you on the western berm. They're going to push through the gap in 4 minutes. I know. She was already moving. The western push was the heaviest contact of the night. What came through the gap was not the disorganized remnant of a disrupted column. It was the portion of the enemy force that had been waiting for exactly this moment, held back, so while the southern approach drew attention and resources. 60, maybe 70 infantry, moving in fire and maneuver with vehicle support, staying low on the slope to mask from direct fire. Echo Company's western element was 6 people. Ward redirected 3 more from the northern wall, which he could do because the northern approach had quieted. The ridge engagement had apparently convinced the force on that side to reassess. 8 people on the western berm was still not 60, but it was better than 6, and better was the only category available. Mara went to work, not the methodical, measured work of the first engagement. This was closer quarters, faster paced, a different set of calculations. At 300 meters and closing, precision long-range shooting becomes precision medium-range shooting, which is a different discipline, even with the same weapon. The BMG platform was built for distance. Using it at 300 meters was like using a calligraphy pen to sign a lease agreement technically capable, but operating outside its design parameters. She adapted. She worked the targets closest to the berm. First, the fire teams were providing suppression to allow the maneuver elements to advance, because remove the suppression and the maneuver element stalls. She was firing faster than she had on the ridge, working the bolt in a rhythm that was almost mechanical, moving position less frequently because the range made flash signature less of a targeting vulnerability. Beside her, on the western berm, Corporal Dietrich was running his weapon with the competent, contained aggression of a soldier who was scared but wasn't letting it make his decisions. He fired, assessed, fired again. He didn't look at Mara except once, briefly, when she shifted position and he registered the movement peripherally. How many rounds do you have? He said, without stopping firing. Enough for now. That's not a number. No, it's not. He didn't push it. He was getting better at reading when she was going to answer and when she wasn't. The Western push lasted 11 minutes. It didn't break. That would be too clean a word for what happened. It stalled, slowed. The leading elements took casualties, and the elements behind them slowed to assess, and the elements behind those slowed. Because the ones in front had slowed, and the momentum that a ground assault depends on evaporated into the rain and the dark and the cost of continuing forward. They pulled back to 250 meters and went to ground. Not gone, regrouping. Ward appeared at the western berm as the firing dropped to sporadic contact. He looked at the terrain, at his people, at their ammunition state, at the sky, which was still black, still raining, still nothing, and did the math out loud to nobody in particular. They're going to try again in 20 minutes. 15, Mara said. He looked at her. The commander on the south column is running out of window, she said. First light is, she checked her watch, 4 hours and change. He can't still be in this fight at first light. He'll push again and push hard. With what? We disrupted their armor. 2 vehicles. They have more. She looked at the slope, and they still have numbers. They're going to trade bodies for position, and they know it, and they've accepted it, which means whoever's commanding that element has made a decision that this objective is worth the cost. She paused. That's not a commander who's going to stop because we made it expensive. Ward stood there in the rain and thought about that, about what it meant for 28 people, 26, who were still on their feet, with Cole immobilized and Reyes limping from the shrapnel, hit against a force that had accepted its own losses as a condition of the objective. What do you need? He said. She thought about it. Honestly, the way she always did, which was becoming something he relied on. More ammunition, she said, and a better position than the western berm when they come back. The berm gives me angle, but not enough elevation. There's a section of the old checkpoint roof that's still standing, if I can get up there. It's exposed. Everything is exposed tonight. Ward looked at the roof section. Partial concrete slab, angled, probably not structurally sound by any civilian standard. In a combat context, cover, elevation, better angle to the western approach. You fall through that, and it's on you, he said. If I fall through it, you'll have bigger problems. That was almost a joke. Ward wasn't entirely sure. He chose to treat it as one. Take Hendricks, he said. I know what he is, she said. Yeah, I'll take him. She turned from the western berm and found Hendricks, where she'd expected to find him not far, positioned at the edge of the activity, watching. He'd found more ammunition, somewhere, which she noted. He was paying attention. She looked at him. He looked at her. Roof, she said. Okay, he said. They moved. The second push came in 14 minutes, not 15. Ward had been off by 60 seconds, which meant Mara had been right, which meant she'd read the enemy commander's calculus more accurately than he had. He noted that and moved on, because there was nothing useful to do with the observation, except appreciate it. What came through the western approach this time was heavier. The 2 remaining armored vehicles had moved up, staying hull down on the slope to provide fire support, while the infantry advanced in extended line, wider spacing. Harder to suppress with the firepower Echo Company had available, designed to force the defenders to spread their fire across a broader frontage. From the checkpoint roof, Mara saw all of it. She started with the vehicles. Not the commanders, this time the vehicles themselves, specifically the optics and sensor clusters that gave them awareness. A 0.5 BMG round through an armored vehicle's sensor housing doesn't destroy the vehicle, but it blinds it, and a blind armored vehicle in close terrain becomes a liability to the force it's supporting rather than an asset. She hit the first vehicle's sensor cluster in 2 shots. Hit the second on the first. 2 blind vehicles was stationary, blocking the approach route for the infantry elements trying to move through the same corridor. The advance slowed. Ward heard it on the line before. He saw it, the change in the firing pattern, from the enemy side. The sound of coordination breaking down, leaders shouting in the dark, the mechanical sound of a vehicle trying to reposition and not having room. She did something to the vehicles, Trevino said from the northern corner, not quite able to see what he was describing. She blinded them, Dietrich said. How? Dietrich didn't answer. He didn't entirely know how either. He knew what he'd seen over the past 2 hours, which was sufficient. On the roof, Mara shifted her attention to the infantry. Not to eliminate at this rate, and with this ammunition, systematic elimination wasn't achievable. To disrupt. To take the specific targets that held the formation together, the squad leaders moving between positions, the communication men keeping the elements connected, the point men marking the advance for the elements behind them. Remove those, and the formation becomes a collection of individuals making local decisions in the dark. She worked for 6 minutes. Then the roof section shifted under her. Not catastrophically, a settling, a groan from the concrete. A 2-inch drop on the left side sent a chunk of material falling into snow interior below. Hendricks grabbed a section of rebar and didn't say anything. Mara paused for exactly the time it took to assess that the structure was still functional, then kept shooting. That was bad, Hendricks said. It held. It's not going to keep holding. I know. She worked the bolt. 2 more minutes. 2 minutes, Hendricks. He looked at the concrete under his hands, at the crack that had appeared along the joint where the slab met the wall, at the woman 6 feet from him who was lying absolutely still on a crumbling roof in a rainstorm in the middle of a firefight, shooting with the same measured calm she'd shown when this whole thing started, as if the structural failure was a scheduling inconvenience. He held the rebar and watched the crack, and didn't say anything else. 2 minutes and 8 seconds later, she stopped firing, broke down her position in 30 seconds, and they came off the roof edge the same way they'd gone up her first. Hendricks behind her, moving fast and low. The second advance had stalled completely. Ward found her at the base of the checkpoint wall, knee down on the wet ground, checking her rifle's action by feel. He'd watched professionally. He'd watched part of the roof section from the eastern mizzen through his binos, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been counting the seconds. The roof isn't safe, he said. I know. Did you know before you went up? She looked up at him. It held. That's not... He stopped. Started again. That's not an answer to the question I asked. She stood up, slowly, favoring the left knee. Her face was wet and pale and showing the math of 31 hours without sleep, plus an adrenaline curve that had been running high for over 2 hours and was starting to collect its payment. No, she said. I wasn't certain it would hold. Ward held that for a moment. And you went up anyway. 15 fewer soldiers coming through the Western Gap seemed like a reasonable trade for a concrete slab that might or might not support my weight. She checked the scope glass for debris. I did the math being your life against. The math being the outcome, she said. Not unkindly. Just flatly. The way someone states a thing they've already made peace with. Captain. I was trained for 7 years to treat those numbers as interchangeable. That doesn't go away because I requested ordinary duty. Ward stared at her. The rain was still falling. The firefight had dropped to sporadic exchanges, the second advance broken, the enemy somewhere in the dark below reassessing for a third time. He wanted to say something. Several things. He had the vocabulary for them. He'd been an officer long enough to have the language for difficult conversations with difficult people. What came out was, your knee. Still functional. I need you functional for what's coming. I know what's coming. I know you know. He took a breath. Get it looked at by Vasquez. 5 minutes. That's an order. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, short and tight, and moved toward the medic's position. Ward watched her go. Then he looked at the ridge, at the valley below, at the dark that was still full of engines and weapons and a force that had already accepted its casualties and was working out the arithmetic of what came next. His radio crackled. A signal partial. Broken. But there. Higher. Finally getting through the jamming with a stronger transmitter. Echo actual. This is Bravo 6. We are inbound, ETA 45 minutes. Can you hold? Ward keyed the handset. He thought about 26 soldiers. About a perimeter that had held through 2 major assaults. About a supply clerk who had been something else and entirely for 7 years and was currently getting her knee taped by his medic. Bravo 6 Echo actual. We can hold. He released the key, then pressed it again. But make it 30. He put the radio down. 45 minutes was a long time. Across the perimeter, Dietrich was redistributing ammunition with the focused economy, simply of someone who had done the count and didn't like the number. Cole was back at his observation position, one good arm, doing what he could. Trevino's element on the north wall was quiet, but watching. And the valley below was not quiet and not done, and the sound of vehicles repositioning carried up through the rain, with the patience of something that had decided to wait for a better angle rather than admit the night was over. Ward looked at his watch. 43 minutes. He went back to work. 43 minutes. Ward said it to himself, the way people repeat a number they're trying to believe. Not a prayer, just arithmetic. 43 minutes between now and Bravo 6's ETA, and the valley below was still full of engines, and the enemy commander down there had already demonstrated that he was not the kind of person who stopped because it was expensive. Vasquez finished wrapping Mara's knee in 4 minutes, which was 1 minute faster than Ward had ordered, and Mara was back at the western berm before the medic had put his kit away. The wrap was tight and functional, and would hold as long as she didn't do anything that required full lateral mobility, which was the kind of condition that sounded reasonable until the situation removed the option of honoring it. She'd taken 3 rounds of ammunition from the case she kept in the rucksack, the last 3. She hadn't told Ward that. She'd done the count herself while Vasquez worked on her knee, looking at the remaining cartridges with the expression of someone running a tab they already knew was going to come due. Dietrich found her at the western berm 30 seconds after she arrived. "What's your ammunition state?" he said. "Enough." "You said that before." "And I was right before." He looked at her. He had the face of a man who had stopped believing comfortable answers 2 hours ago. Mara. She looked at him. The use of her first name registered. He'd never used it before tonight. Always Voss. Or nothing. 3 rounds, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The rain filled the silence. 3, he repeated. 3. He looked at the western slope, at the darkness that still held vehicles and infantry, and a commander who had decided this objective was worth the cost. He ran the math the way everyone on the line was running math to resources against requirements, time against capacity, what they had against what was coming. "We need to tell Ward," he said. "After the next push," she said. "Not before." "Why?" "Because right now I'm an asset, and he'll use me accordingly. The moment he knows I'm down to 3 rounds, I become a problem he has to manage." She kept her eyes on the slope. "I'd rather be useful for 3 more shots than managed for 0. Dietrich looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who made decisions carelessly, Ohio background. 3 older brothers, father who fixed things rather than replaced them. He thought about things before he committed to them. "Okay," he said. After the push, she nodded. He went back to his position. The third push came with armor leading. Not the blinded vehicles from before those had been pulled back, which told Ward something about the command element below. They'd recognized the mistake, adjusted, and come back with a different approach. The 2 vehicles that appeared at the top of the western slope were running with hatches closed, commanders inside, relying entirely on optics and sensors. No exposed personnel, no obvious targeting solution for a precision rifle. Behind the vehicles, infantry moved in 2 columns, using the vehicles as mobile cover, staying tight to the silhouettes. Not ideal tactically, you don't cluster infantry around armor in complex terrain, but understandable when you've already lost a commander to a marksman and you're trying to reduce your exposure. Ward saw the formation from the eastern wall and felt the specific cold of recognizing a problem that doesn't have a clean answer. Voss. He was on the radio. They're buttoned up. Both vehicles. Infantry's using them for cover. A pause. I see them, see, she said. Give me 60 seconds. He gave her 60 seconds. What she did in those 60 seconds, she watched the vehicles move. Tracked their speed, deliberate, low gear, terrain following. Noted the angle of their advance. Looked at the ground ahead of them, at the point where the western slope flattened into the approach corridor, at the section of old drainage culvert that ran across the corridor 30 meters from the berm, visible as a slight depression in the terrain, barely distinguishable from ground level, obvious from elevation. She'd seen it on her first day. She'd cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, automatically without knowing why, because 7 years of doing this work had made the habit structural. Armored vehicles crossing a culvert slow down. Not much. 2 seconds, maybe 3, while the chassis articulates over the depression. 2 seconds where the vehicle's movement is predictable. She ranged the culvert. 260 meters. At 260 meters, with 3 rounds remaining, she was not trying to defeat the vehicle's armor. She was trying to defeat the infantry, using it for cover specifically, the moment when the vehicle's crossing movement forced the soldiers beside it to adjust their position, to step away from the chassis to avoid being caught by the articulation, to briefly expose themselves from behind the silhouette they'd been hiding in. 2 seconds of exposure. She waited for the first vehicle to hit the culvert. Ward, watching from the eastern wall, saw the vehicle slow, saw the infantry elements beside it shift outward by 2 steps, 3 steps, automatic response to the chassis movement. Saw the muzzle flash from the checkpoint berm. 3 shots. 4 seconds. 3 separate targets. The infantry element that had been using the first vehicle for cover had just lost 3 of its fire team leaders in the time it took for the vehicle to cross a drainage culvert. The formation didn't break, but it stopped. It stopped the way a person stops when they've been walking confidently, and then the ground does something unexpected beneath their feet, that sudden, full-body reassessment. The vehicle kept moving. The infantry did not. An infantry that isn't moving in a ground assault is infantry that is losing. Ward heard the change before he saw it. The rhythm of incoming fire shifted, less coordinated, more sporadic, individual weapons making individual decisions instead of a formation executing a plan. They're stalling, Trevino said, from the north corner. Don't get comfortable, Ward said. He moved to the western berm, found Mara there with the rifle in her hands and the chamber open. Empty. He looked at the rifle, at her, at the western slope, where the third advance was losing its coherence. 3 rounds, he said. Flat. Certain. That was the last of them, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze without apology or explanation, just the level, direct look of someone who had made a calculation and stood by it. You should have told me, he said. I know. Mara. It worked, she said. Captain, the math worked. That's the outcome. Ward opened his mouth. Then he looked at the slope, at the stalled advance, at the window they'd just bought with 3 precisely placed rounds, and he closed his mouth again. Because she was right. The math had worked. And he was self-aware enough to know that if he'd known about the ammunition state before the push, he would have repositioned her, managed her, kept her in reserve, and the formation that was now stalled might still be moving. You don't get to make that call unilaterally, he said. No, sir. We'll have a longer conversation about that. Yes, sir. He held her gaze for another second. Then he turned to the slope. The third advance had stalled, but it hadn't broken. The 2 armored vehicles were at the edge of the approach corridor, stopped, waiting for the infantry to reorganize. The infantry was reorganizing. They could see movement in the dark, Figures pulling back to covered positions, leaders doing the same thing Ward was doing right now, assessing, adjusting, preparing for the next attempt. They had 40 minutes until Bravo 6. The enemy had 2 functional vehicles, approximately 60 infantry, and a commander who had not stopped yet. And Mara had an empty rifle. Ward pulled his element leaders together at the checkpoint structure. Not a formal briefing, there wasn't time or space for that. 5 people standing in a broken doorway in the rain, talking fast. Ammunition state, he said. Martinez, maybe 90 rounds for the belt fed. 2 mags after that. Dietrich, I've got 200 spread across my element. Maybe. Trevino, about the same. Ward looked at Cole, who was present despite the arm, because Cole showed up. You're not shooting. I'm aware. You can talk to me about observation. That I can do. Ward turned to Mara. She was standing slightly apart from the group, rifle slung, left hand on the checkpoint wall to take some weight off the knee. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been awake for 33 hours and was still doing the work of someone on their first hour. But there were signs. The color was off. The movement was more deliberate than it had been. Options, he said. It wasn't directed at anyone. It was directed at the room. Dietrich said it first. Redistribute and hold the berm. They've got armor. We can't stop armor with small arms at the berm. We hold until Bravo 6. 40 minutes, Ward said. Against 2 vehicles and 60 people with the ammunition states you just gave me. Silence. Alternate position, Martinez said. Pull back to the interior structure. Let them take the outer berm. Make them fight building by building. We lose the firing angles, and we compress our perimeter they surround us. We've got no room left. More silence. Then Mara said, the radio tower. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the northeast corner of the ridge, at the old corner of the ridge, the old communication structure that had been sitting there since before any of them arrived. A steel and concrete tower, maybe 45 meters high, partially deteriorated, still standing. Mostly because nothing hadn't hit it directly. It's the highest point on the ridge, she said. From that elevation, I can see the entire approach corridor, both vehicle positions and the infantry's covered positions on the western slope. You don't have ammunition, Ward said. I'll take Martinez's belt fed. Martinez looked at the weapon in his hands. This isn't a precision. I know what it is. She looked at Ward. From 45 meters elevation, I can direct fire on the vehicle positions, on the approach corridor, on the infantry elements before they reform. I don't need precision. I need volume at the right angle. The tower is exposed from every direction, Ward said. Yes, there's no cover up there. No, the counter-sniper threat is a real problem, she said. I know. I'm not pretending it isn't. Ward stared at her, at the tower, at the western slope where the enemy was regrouping with 2 armored vehicles and patients. I'll draw their attention, she said. Your people on the berm get a window 6, maybe 8 minutes before they redirect everything at the tower. That's your window to reposition, redistribute. Set up the defense that holds until Bravo 6 arrives. 6 minutes, Ward said. 8 if I'm lucky. And then? She didn't answer that part. Ward felt the cold move through him that wasn't the rain. He'd been in enough situations to know what an answer that didn't come meant. No, he said. Captain, that's not a tactical plan. It's the best available option, she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still level. Still the same measured, direct register she'd used since she'd walked to the center of the perimeter and opened a case nobody knew she was carrying. I've looked at everything else. This is what gives your people the best chance. You know that. I'm not sending you up a deteriorating radio tower with no cover and no exit. You're not sending me, she held his gaze. I'm going. The distinction was precise and deliberate and landed exactly as she intended. Ward heard it. Everyone in the doorway heard it. There was a quality to it, not insubordination, not defiance, something that was harder to argue with than either of those things. The statement of a person who had already completed the calculation and was presenting the result. 3 years ago, she said, I was 3 seconds too slow. Someone hesitated and 2 people died. She paused. I'm not making that choice tonight. Ward looked at her, at the people around him, at the tower. Martinez goes with you, he said. He operates the gun. You direct. Martinez needs to be on the berm. Hendricks. She looked at Hendricks, who was in the doorway behind Martinez, who had heard every word of this conversation, and whose face was doing the thing it did when he was committing to something before his brain had finished the sentence. He's not trained for... He climbed the ridge with you, Ward said. In the dark, during a firefight, when nobody told him to. He met her eyes. He's trained enough. Mara looked at Hendricks for a long moment. Hendricks looked back. I'll carry the ammunition, he said. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Fine, she said. They moved for the tower at a run. Not sprint, the knee wouldn't support sprint, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. A hard jog, staying low, using the north wall of the checkpoint structure for cover until the angle forced them into the open. Hendricks was behind her with the ammunition, and Martinez's belt fed, hanging across his back, weight distributed the way she'd showed him in 30 seconds before they moved. The tower base was 30 meters of open ground from the checkpoint wall. She covered it in 8 seconds. Artillery didn't come. Counterfire didn't come. Either the enemy hadn't seen them move, or they were waiting to see what the tower would be used for before committing assets. She'd put her money on the ladder the enemy commander had demonstrated all night that he thought ahead. This stopped. The tower's access ladder was on the east face. Welded steel rungs, industrial, old enough that some of the lower ones had oxidized to a roughness that bit into the palms. She went up first. The knee announced itself on every other rung with a specific, focused objection that she noted and continued filing. Under-acknowledged, not addressed. Hendricks came up behind her, arms loaded, moving slower but steadily. He didn't complain about the weight. She'd noticed he didn't complain about things in general, which was more valuable than most people understood. The tower structure narrowed as they climbed. By the time she reached the operational platform, a steel grating about 4 meters square, surrounded by a railing that had lost most of its integrity. She was 38 meters off the ground. The rain hit differently up here, horizontal sometimes when the wind caught it. The metal was slick. She got into position. Hendricks handed her the belt fed, then settled the ammunition where she could access it without taking her eye off the approach corridor. She looked down. The entire western approach was visible. Both armored vehicles, stationary, at the approach corridor entrance, waiting for the infantry to consolidate. The infantry moving in the dark below, she could see them. The shapes of figures moving between covered positions. The brief flare of a radio in someone's hand. The deliberate compression of a force preparing to push again. She keyed the radio. Actual Voss. I'm in position. I have visual on both vehicles and the infantry element. They're consolidating for another push. ETA on movement maybe 6 minutes. Ward's voice, copy. Stand by. Then after a pause, Echo Company, this is actual. Western Berm, listen up. When Voss opens fire, I want controlled displacement Dietrich. Take your element 15 meters north. Martinez, cover the gap. We are tightening the perimeter on my call. Hold until you hear fire from the tower, then move. Acknowledge. Acknowledgements came back. Ward again directly to her, Voss. You have a window. Use it. She looked at the vehicles. At the infantry, at the approach corridor. She thought about 43 minutes. About Bravos 6, about 26 people on the ground below who had held through 2 major assaults and were still holding. She thought, briefly, about a convoy 3 years ago. About the difference between hesitation and choice. Then she stopped thinking and started working. The first burst caught the infantry element mid-consolidation. A belt fed at 38 meters elevation was a completely different instrument from the 0.5 Cal BMG she'd been running all night. It was loud and imprecise and burned through ammunition at a rate that made her internally wince with every trigger pull. But at this angle, with this visibility, imprecision was relative. She wasn't shooting at a single target. She was shooting at a kill zone, and at this elevation, everything in the approach corridor was inside it. The infantry scattered. The armored vehicles turned their turrets toward the tower. She saw the movement, tracked it, shifted her position on the platform by 2 meters without standing fully upright. The vehicle's direct fire capability was limited by the elevation angle. Not eliminated, limited. There was a difference, and it mattered. She fired another burst at the infantry elements, trying to reorganize at the tree line. Shifted left, fired at the closer vehicle's track system, not to destroy it, to force the crew to make a decision, to redirect their attention from the infantry consolidation to their own survival calculus. The vehicle reversed. Below her, she could hear the perimeter movement, Dietrich's element shifting, Martinez covering the gap, Ward's voice cutting through the radio in controlled bursts. They were using the window. They were moving. The counterfire started at minute 3. Small arms first high, most of it, because shooting up at an elevated target at night and rain is a genuinely difficult problem, and most of the fire was unaimed suppression rather than deliberate targeting. But suppression didn't need to be accurate to be effective. It needed to make her keep her head down, which it was doing. "You okay?" Hendricks said. He was flat on the platform grating, holding the ammunition feed with both hands to keep it from fouling. "Fine. I know it's not a number." She fired another burst. Shifted right. "I'm fine." He looked at his hands. The grating was shaking. The tower was resonating with the impacts of small arms fire, hitting the lower structure, not penetrating, but the vibration carried through steel. It had a sound, a specific metallic hum that you felt in your palms and your chest rather than heard. She fired at the second vehicle's sensor cluster. Hit it on the third burst, which was not what she would have called precision work. The belt-fed didn't love precision, and her position on the grating was less stable than she wanted. But the vehicle's optics went dark, and the commander's optics went dark, and the commander who'd been guiding from inside went blind, and a blind armored vehicle in the dark is making decisions based on information that is already 30 seconds old. The vehicle stopped moving. Minute 4. "Actual Voss," she said into the radio. "Both vehicles are disrupted. Infantry is scattered, but not broken. Your window is closing. They're going to redirect." "Copy." "Ward. 2 more minutes. Hold 2 more minutes." She looked at the slope, at the infantry elements regrouping faster than someone wanted down there, was doing good work, pulling people back into position with the controlled urgency of a leader who hadn't accepted the disruption as defeat. She fired at that someone, missed. The range estimation was off. She'd been running on a combination of experience and instinct for 6 hours, and the instinct was getting tired. She adjusted and fired again. The figure moved differently after the second burst, which wasn't confirmation, but was suggestive. Then the tower took a hit. Not small arms, something larger. An RPG round that hit the lower structure 20 meters below the platform and sent a compression wave up through the steel that was different in character from everything before it. The platform dropped 2 inches on the northwest corner. Not catastrophically, a partial failure of one of the supporting members, not the whole thing. But 2 inches was information. Hendricks grabbed the railing with his free hand. The railing partially gave way, and he grabbed the platform, grating instead, fingers through the mesh. "We need to go," he said. 1 more minute. The tower is." 1 minute, Hendricks." He looked at her, at the northwest corner where the platform had dropped, at the grating under him, which was vibrating in a way that felt increasingly unlike the earlier vibrations. "Okay," he said. He let go of the railing and put his hand back on the ammunition feed. 1 minute. She fired continuously, for seconds, not bursts, sustained fire to deny the approach corridor to the infantry elements that were trying to push back through it. The barrel was hot enough to see the heat distortion, even in the rain. The platform was groaning now, a continuous low sound that came through the structure and into her chest. Ward on the radio, "Voss, we're in position. Break contact." She released the trigger. "Moving," she said. She handed the empty weapon to Hendricks, got upright, and took one step toward the ladder access point on the east face. The northwest corner of the platform dropped another 6 inches. The movement was sudden enough that she went to one knee, the wrong knee, the left one, and the pain was immediate and specific and demanded her complete attention for approximately 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds she didn't have. Hendricks was at her left side before she'd registered. He'd moved, hand on her arm, not lifting, just providing the anchor point she needed to get the knee under her again. "Ladder," she said, already looking at it. The ladder was still intact. The structural failure was in the northwest corner of the platform. The section between her current position and the ladder was still solid, or appeared to be solid, which, in the current context, was the distinction she was going to have to operate on. She moved to the ladder. The tower took a second impact below another RPG, lower this time, meant to bring the structure down. The steel rang like something enormous striking it, the sound arriving before the vibration, and the platform lurched. She was on the ladder when it happened, hands and feet both on the rungs, and she held on while the structure moved and tried to understand which direction was still reliable. Hendricks was on the ladder, 2 rungs above her. He'd gone first at her instruction. She told him to move, while she was still on the platform, told him she was right behind him. And she had been, but the RPG had arrived in the window between his first rung and her first rung. "Keep moving," she said from below him. "I'm moving. Faster. I'm going as fast as..." The platform collapsed. She heard it go, the groan of steel giving way, the sharp crack of the support members failing in sequence, the weight of the grating and the railing and everything else that had been up there coming down. It missed the ladder by perhaps 2 meters. The impact reached her through the rungs, a percussion that tried to knock her hands loose. She tightened her grip and kept descending. Hendricks reached the ground first and moved clear of the tower base immediately, which was the right instinct. She came off the last rung and moved away from the structure, away from the falling debris still coming down the damaged sections, and her left knee gave on the second step, and she went down to one hand on the wet ground and got up again before Hendricks could reach her. "I'm up," she said. "Move." They ran for the checkpoint wall. Small arms followed them, sporadic, reactive fire from the western slope, not well aimed. She registered the impacts in the ground around her without stopping. The checkpoint wall came up, and she went through the gap in the eastern face and sat down against the interior wall with her back against concrete and her rifle across her lap and her left knee doing something she was going to address later. The knee would have opinions about later. She would address them then. Hendricks came through the gap 7 seconds behind her and sat down on the opposite side of the gap, back against the wall, breathing hard. They looked at each other across the narrow space. Outside, Western berm was holding. She could hear it in the weapon signatures, the organized rhythm of Echo Company's defensive fire. The enemy's third push had broken, not because they'd run out of will, but because the window of disorganization she'd bought from the tower had been enough for Ward to use. "Tower's gone," Hendricks said. "I know." He was looking at her knee, at the way she was holding it, slightly elevated, one hand resting over it without touching. He had the look of someone who wanted to say something and was choosing words. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't. You were about to tell me that was close." He closed his mouth. "It was close," she said. "I know. You don't have to say it." He leaned his head back against the wall. Outside, weapons fired. The rain kept falling. Somewhere in the valley, vehicles were moving again. She could hear the diesel sound settling into a new pattern, which meant repositioning, which meant the enemy commander was making another plan. They had time now. Ward's repositioned perimeter had time. Bravo 6 was close enough to feel if not to see. But the valley was not done with them. She could feel it in the way the engine sounds moved, purposeful, not retreating, reorganizing, with the patience of a force that had lost the initiative temporarily and was in the process of taking it back. She sat against the checkpoint wall and listened to the approaching sound and let herself have 30 seconds of being a person who was tired and in pain and had burned through everything she had over the course of 6 hours before putting it away again. 29 seconds. Then she pushed herself up the wall, tested the knee, and went to find Ward. There were still 30 minutes until Bravo 6, and 30 minutes tonight was a very long time. Ward was at the northern wall when she found him. He was on the radio partial connection, better than before. The jamming had either degraded or Bravo 6 was running a counter-jamming package on approach. She could hear enough of the transmission to know the QRF was still inbound, still on timeline, still 26 minutes out. Ward acknowledged, reset the handset, and turned to find her 3 feet behind him. He looked at her knee first, then at her face, then at the empty rifle slung across her back. "Tower's down," she said. "I watched it go." He studied her for a moment. "You're still standing, more or less." He looked at the knee again. The wrap Vasquez had done was still in place, but the fabric around it was darker, not blood, she thought, or not much blood, more likely fluid from the impact, the kind of swelling that shows up later and makes the next morning very unpleasant. She'd know more about it when she could stop moving. "Vasquez," he said after she said, "Now, Captain. There are still 26 minutes in a valley full of." "Vasquez will take 4 minutes. You can't shoot anything with an empty rifle, and you can barely walk. Take the 4 minutes." He held her gaze. "That's not a request." She looked at him. At the northern wall, where Trevino's element was maintaining coverage. At the western berm, where the reorganized perimeter was holding the silence that always came between pushes, that operational pause that felt like rest, but wasn't. 4 minutes, she said. She found Vasquez at the aid station he'd set up in the most sheltered corner of the checkpoint interior, a folding kit, chemical light, the organized efficiency of a man who'd been working in bad conditions long enough to make bad conditions his normal. He looked at the knee with a penlight, asked her 2 questions she answered honestly, and told her what she'd already suspected. The joint was intact, nothing structural, significant soft tissue involvement, and she was going to be on crutches in approximate 12 hours, whether she liked it or not. "Right now?" she said. "Right now it'll hold if you're careful." Define careful. He looked at her. "Don't run. Don't climb. Don't do anything you've been doing for the last 3 hours." "Okay," she said. "You're going to do all of those things anyway." "Probably." He wrapped it tighter, taped it, told her to stay off it as much as possible, and moved to the next patient before she could thank him. She sat against the checkpoint wall for 30 seconds, listening to the perimeter, listening to the valley, doing the accounting of what she had left. Empty rifle, functional hands, functional eyes, one reliable knee and one that was submitting written objections. 6 hours of accumulated fatigue, running somewhere beneath the adrenaline, like a tide that hadn't come in yet, but was going to. She got up and went back to Ward. The 4th push didn't come the way she'd expected. She'd been tracking the vehicle sounds from the valley, the diesel pattern she'd been reading all night, the way engine noise in mountain terrain gives you information about movement and direction and intent if you know how to read it. She'd been expecting another frontal assault, another attempt on the western berm, maybe with a flanking element to split Echo Company's coverage. The enemy commander had been running variations on the same play all night, adjusting for losses, adapting to the defense, but staying within a framework. Direct pressure plus armor forced the perimeter to compress, break it from the front. What came instead was quiet, not the quiet of withdrawal. She'd been in enough firefights to know the difference between an enemy that was done and an enemy that was thinking. This was thinking quiet. The vehicles had moved during the tower engagement, and She'd lost the pattern, which direction, which distance, she didn't know. The infantry that had been reorganizing on the western slope wasn't showing itself. The occasional probing fire that had been keeping Echo Company's heads down had stopped, she told Ward. They've repositioned, she said. I don't know where. Moving around the ridge? It's possible. The eastern approach is longer, but it comes out above us. If they've got a force element that's been moving for the last hour. She looked at the eastern slope, at the darkness above the perimeter. We've been focused on the western approach all night. If he's been holding an eastern element in reserve, waiting for us to commit everything to the west. Ward was already on the radio. Trevino, east slope. Full coverage. Now. Report anything. Trevino's voice came back. Already seeing movement, sir. Top of the eastern ridge. Figures I count maybe 20. Moving down. Ward looked at Mara. She looked at the eastern slope. 20 figures coming down from the high ground. Through the position, she and Hendricks had cleared of counter snipers 3 hours ago. Through terrain she'd already been on tonight. Terrain she knew. East wall, she said. You don't have ammunition. I have eyes and a radio. She was already moving. And your people on the east wall don't know that ground. I do. Ward went with her. The eastern approach was different terrain from the western, steeper, more broken, more cover for a descending force, but also more obstacles to their movement. 20 figures coming down in the dark, even with good equipment, even with preparation, was slow work. They had time. Not much, but some. Trevino's 3-person element had the east wall. Ward added Martinez and Dietrich, pulling them from the western berm, where the threat had, for the moment, paused. That left the western approach with four people, which was thin, but 4 people on a berm, with clear sight lines and adequate ammunition, was a different problem from 20 people descending through broken terrain. Mara positioned herself at the highest point of the checkpoint's eastern wall, a section of concrete that gave her 18 inches of elevation and a clear sight line up the slope. No rifle. She had Ward's binos and her radio, and the knowledge of the terrain that she'd been building since she stepped off the vehicle on day 1. She directed, not shooting calling. She watched figures move through the darkness with the same reading she'd been applying to terrain all night, and she translated what she saw into targeting information for the people beside her who had working weapons. Left of the third boulder, 2 figures close together, moving toward the drainage cut. 30 meters closing. Dietrich fired. Martinez corrected left and fired. One of the 2 figures went down. The other went to ground and stopped moving, which might mean wounded or might mean cover. She kept watching. Another 2 behind the terrace wall, she said. 45 meters. They're going to break left in about 10 seconds. That's the natural route through the terrain. How do you know? Dietrich said. Because I used it tonight. Go left of the terrace wall end, 3 meters. He went left. When the figures broke from cover, they broke left. He was already there. It was not a clean engagement. It never was. People made adjustments she didn't anticipate, moved differently than the terrain suggested, did things that were tactically suboptimal because they were scared or tired or reacting to something she couldn't see from her position. Twice, she called a direction that turned out to be wrong and had to correct. Once she lost track of a figure entirely for 90 seconds, and it reappeared 30 meters from where she'd expected, close enough to the wall that Trevino had to break cover to deal with it at close range, which resulted in Trevino taking a hit across the left shoulder that Vasquez would later describe as dramatic-looking but not structural. But the eastern push slowed, then stopped. Then, and this was the thing she hadn't predicted, the thing she only understood afterward when she had time to think about it, broke. Not because Echo Company had eliminated them, because they'd lost the initiative. The element coming down the eastern slope was a flanking force, designed to hit a perimeter that was committed on the western side and wasn't watching the east. When the east wall turned out to be as defended as the west, when the element met coordinated resistance instead of an exposed flank, the plan stopped working. And a plan that stops working at night, in broken terrain, with 20 people who are now taking fire from a fixed defensive position, becomes a plan to get out of contact and reassess. They pulled back up the slope. Mara watched them go. She stayed at the wall and watched until the movement on the eastern slope had been absent long enough to be meaningful, and then she stayed another 3 minutes, because that was her habit, and her habit had kept her alive. Then she sat down on top of the concrete wall section and let herself stop, briefly, because the moment between one thing ending and the next thing starting was the only moment available. Ward appeared beside her. He stood there for a moment, without saying anything, which she appreciated. 17 minutes, he said. I know. They pulled back. For now. He looked at the valley. The vehicle sounds had changed. Again, she could hear it too, a different quality to the diesel note, something that might have been increasing range, might have been repositioning, might have been the beginning of something she didn't have enough information to characterize. I think they're done, Ward said. Maybe. Your read? She thought about it. About the night, about the pattern, about the commander who had run 4 attempts against a position that had held each time. About the eastern flanking effort that had failed when the flank turned out not to be open. He's out of moves, she said. He had a direct assault, armor support, counter sniper teams, and a flanking element. All of them ran into something he didn't expect. She paused. At some point, the math stops working in his favor, and he knows it. If Bravo 6 shows up while he's still committed, he's got a QRF hitting him from behind while he's in contact with a fixed defense. That's a bad place to be, so he's breaking contact. Probably started 10 minutes ago. Ward was quiet for a moment. 17 minutes, he said again. Differently this time. Yeah, she said. Bravo 6 arrived in 14. 3 vehicles, infantry dismounted and clearing the approach corridor before the lead vehicle was fully stopped a well-drilled QRF, SOT, running a practiced entry, the kind that happened when people had done it enough times that it became automatic. Ward met the element leader at the checkpoint entrance, exchanged the critical information in under 2 minutes, and redirected the fresh forces to the eastern and western approaches for clearance. The valley was quiet. Not completely. There was sporadic contact on the southwestern approach for another 20 minutes. A rear guard element covering the withdrawal, the kind of controlled fighting retreat that confirmed she'd been right about the enemy commander's decision. But the perimeter held. The QRF cleared the immediate terrain, and by the time the sky started its first suggestion of pre-dawn gray, Blackstone Ridge was in friendly hands. Echo Company had 27 people standing at end of engagement. Cole's arm, Trevino's shoulder, 3 other minor casualties. Professionally, 27 of 28, which, in the context of the night they'd had, was a number that landed differently than the raw arithmetic suggested, was sitting against the checkpoint wall when the accounting reached her. Ward said it to no one in particular, standing in the center of the perimeter with the QRF element leader, and she heard it and stayed where she was and did nothing with it because there was nothing appropriate to do. She was aware that she was shaking slightly, not dramatically, a fine tremor in her hands that came when the adrenaline system finished its run and handed the body back to the person who had to live in it. She'd experienced it before. She knew what it was. She put her hands flat on her thighs and waited for it to pass. Hendricks found her there. He sat down against the wall, 2 feet from her, and didn't say anything for a while. His face looked like the face of someone who had been 19 years old yesterday and was something different today, without being entirely sure what that something was. She recognized it. She'd worn it once herself, a long time ago. You okay? He said eventually. I'll be okay, she said, which was different, and he was sharp enough to notice the difference. And he let it go, which was the right call. 27, he said. Yeah, that's because of you. She shook her head. Not a correction, a deflection, or maybe something more honest than a deflection. That's because 27 people held a perimeter for 6 hours. I helped. He looked at her sideways. You ran out of ammunition and climbed a deteriorating radio tower. Ward made good decisions. Dietrich ran his section well. Martinez kept the belt fed working when it mattered. She paused. You told me about the contacts on the east slope early enough that I had time. That mattered. He was quiet. Take the things you did, she said. Let other people carry the rest. He looked at his hands for a while. She looked at the sky, which was starting to change still dark, but differently dark, the kind of dark that has somewhere else to be. What happens now? He said. She thought about that. She didn't have an answer that felt complete, so she gave him the one she had. They'll want to talk, she said. People always want to talk. The debrief happened at a forward operating base, 40 kilometers from Blackstone Ridge. In a concrete room with a folding table and 4 chairs and the specific institutional smell of a building that has been a military facility long enough to have absorbed the function into the walls. Mara's knee had been properly examined by a physician who confirmed what Vasquez had said and added a timeline she chose not to think about. She was on crutches. She was already finding ways to minimize. The people on the other side of the table were Ward, a lieutenant colonel named Pressman who ran the brigade's intelligence element, and a man in civilian clothes whose name she hadn't been given and didn't ask for. She'd been in rooms with that type before. The name was rarely the point. Pressman started, Private Voss. He had a yellow legal pad and a pen he kept clicking. Let's start with the rifle. Okay, she said. It's not a standard issue item. It doesn't appear on Echo Company's property book. It doesn't appear on any property book I've been able to access in the last 4 hours. He clicked the pen. Where did it come from? I brought it with me. From where? From before. Before my current assignment. She looked at him evenly. The unit I was previously attached to authorized personnel to retain certain equipment on separation. The rifle was mine. I kept it. Pressman looked at the civilian. The civilian was looking at Mara with the particular focused attention of someone who is deciding how much they already know versus how much they're about to find out. Nightglass, the civilian said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. You were separated from Nightglass 14 months ago. He had a thin file in front of him that he hadn't opened yet. At your request, yes. The unit's records indicate your departure was, he paused, choosing the word carefully, contentious. The unit didn't want me to leave, she said. I left anyway. The process took 3 months and several conversations I don't particularly want to revisit. Why did you leave? She'd known this question was coming. She'd been deciding, since the ride to the FOB, how much of the true answer she was going to give. I asked for ordinary duty, she said. I had operational concerns that I raised through appropriate channels. Those concerns were not addressed in a way I found acceptable. I determined that I could not continue in that role with confidence in the command structure supporting it. Pressman, what operational concerns? The mission that preceded my request for separation involved targeting parameters that I considered insufficiently verified. I expressed that view. I was overruled. The mission proceeded. She paused. The outcome was consistent with my concerns. Meaning? Meaning the target was not who we were told he was. The room was quiet for a moment. Ward, who had been sitting to her left and slightly back present as her commanding officer, technically, though in this room the hierarchy was doing something complicated, shifted slightly in his chair. That's not in your file, the civilian said. It wouldn't be. Are you saying the unit falsified the mission record? I'm saying the mission record, as I was shown it, did not reflect the outcome as I experienced it. She held his gaze. I'm also saying that's not why I'm in this room. Pressman, then why are you in this room? Because last night, I used equipment and applied capabilities that aren't consistent with my current assignment and rank. You want to know what I am and what to do with me. I understand that. She put her hands on the table. What I'd prefer is that we spend less time on what I was and more time on whether anyone is going to acknowledge that 27 people came home from Black Stone Ridge. Ward said quietly, "They're going to acknowledge it." "I know you will," she said to him. Then, to Pressman and the civilian, "I'm less certain about the rest of the room." Pressman set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing the structure of the conversation. "Private, what you want to know," she said, "is whether I'm a liability. Whether the rifle, the capabilities, the Nightglass connection, the mission record dispute, whether any of that is going to become a problem you have to manage." She kept her voice level. "I can tell you that in 14 months of ordinary duty, I have been assigned to 4 different, and I have not TIST or different units, discharged a weapon in any operational context. Last night was the exception, not the pattern. The exception was necessary. I'd make the same choice again." "That's exactly the kind of statement that concerns us," Pressman said. "Good," she said. "It should. A soldier who tells you she'd make a different choice to avoid the paperwork is a soldier you can't trust." She paused. "I'd rather be the kind of problem you can predict." The civilian opened his file, looked at something in it for a moment, closed it. "Nightglass would like you back," he said. She'd expected that too. "No," she said. "You've demonstrated." "I know what I demonstrated." Her voice was still level, still controlled. But underneath the control, something that had been wound tight for 6 hours was starting to show its edges. "I demonstrated that under extreme circumstances, with 27 lives in the balance, I could apply capabilities I spent 7 years developing. That's not the same as being ready to go back to what I was doing." "Why not?" "Last night suggests last night was self-defense. Last night was Echo Company. Last night was a specific situation with a specific moral accounting that I could live with." She looked at him. "What Nightglass does is different. The targeting parameters are different. The command chain is different. The accounting is different, and I've already told you what I think about that accounting." "Pressman, you're refusing a direct..." "He's not in my chain of command," she said, nodding at the civilian. "He's asking, not ordering. If someone in my chain of command orders me back to Nightglass, we'll have that conversation with the appropriate documentation." She paused. "I suspect everyone in this room knows that conversation would become complicated quickly." The civilians looked at her. She looked back. It was, she thought, probably the most direct thing she'd said to anyone representing that world since the day she'd walked out of it, and she was aware that saying it carried consequences she couldn't fully predict. She said it anyway. Ward to her left was quiet. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The civilian closed his file, put it in his bag. He looked like a man who had come to a room expecting one outcome and found a different one, and who was deciding whether the new outcome was usable. "The rifle," he said finally. "What about it? It needs to be accounted for." "Then account for it." "It's mine. I'm keeping it." Pressman started to say something. The civilian raised one hand, barely, and Pressman stopped. "All right," the civilian said. He stood up. "We'll be in touch." "I'm sure," she said. He left. The door clicked behind him with the specific sound of institutional authority, choosing to defer rather than confront. Pressman gathered his legal pad, clicked his pen one more time, and left without making eye contact. She watched him go. Then she and Ward were alone in the room. Ward leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "The mission record dispute," he said. "The one you mentioned?" "Yes." "The target that wasn't who they said?" "Yes." "Is that the reason you hesitated?" 3 years ago." "Is that the thing that locked up in your chest?" She hadn't expected that question. Not from him, not in those words. She sat with it for a moment, giving it the honesty it deserved. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe. I've thought about it until thinking about it stopped being useful." She looked at her hands. The tremor was gone. At some point in the last 2 hours, it had stopped without her noticing. "What I know is that it's not locked up the same way anymore. Because of last night." "Because of last night," she agreed. and because the math was different, and because she stopped, then decided to finish it. Because Hendricks came up the ridge when nobody told him to, and Cole told me what he could see from the wall even when he couldn't do anything with it, and Dietrich called me by my first name. It's hard to hesitate when people are doing that. Ward was quiet for a while. 27, he said. 27, she agreed. He looked at the table, at the space where Pressman's legal pad had been, at the room that felt different with the institutional weight of the other two men removed from it. You should know, he said, that I'm submitting a full account of last night. Every decision, every shot, every tactical choice, including the roof and the tower and the ammunition state you didn't disclose. He looked at her. All of it. I know, she said. You should. It's going to raise questions. More questions, she corrected. More questions, he agreed. Are you ready for that? She thought about the room she'd just been sitting in, about civilian with the closed file, about Nightglass and the 3 months it had taken to leave, and the 14 months of supply, runs, and anonymity that had followed, about a convoy 3 years ago and the specific wait of 3 seconds. I've been carrying something for a long time, she said. Having people ask questions about it is probably better than the alternative. Ward nodded. He stood up, pushed the chair in, and looked at her across the table. For what it's worth, he said, I don't care what unit you came from. I don't care about the mission record dispute, or the rifle, or the 14 months of supply runs. He paused. I care that when 28 people needed something that didn't exist in the room, you stood up. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's why I told you the truth. He nodded once and left. She sat in the concrete room alone for a while, with the folding table and the 4 chairs and the smell of institutional permanence, and let the quiet settle after something loud. Through the small window near the ceiling, the sky outside had finished its change, fully light now. Gray and even, the rain finally stopped. She looked at her hands. Still, both of them. She picked up her crutches, got herself upright, and walked out. The hallway outside the debrief room was empty. She stood on the crutches for a moment, adjusting the weight distribution the way she'd been doing since the physician fitted them left side, slightly lower, angled out, compensating for the way the knee still wanted to give if she forgot about it. The fob hallway smelled like concrete and recycled air and the particular institutional coffee that existed at every military facility she'd ever been in, the kind that was always slightly burnt and always slightly necessary. She stood there and breathed for a moment. Then she heard Hendricks. He was at the end of the hallway, sitting on a bench that had been placed there for no clear reason, one of those pieces of furniture that appears in institutional buildings, as if they grew there, with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly down. He looked up when she came out. He had the appearance of someone who had been waiting and was trying not to look like he'd been waiting. You didn't have to stay, she said. I know. She moved to the bench and sat down beside him, one crutch leaning against the wall, the other across her knees. The hallway was quiet. Through a small window at the far end, gray morning light came in at a low angle. How'd it go? He said. About how I expected. What does that mean? It means they asked questions I was ready for, and I gave answers they weren't. She paused. It'll be fine, or it won't. Either way, I said what I said. He looked at his hands. He had a quality she'd noticed on the ridge, a way of being present in a conversation without filling the space unnecessarily, which was rarer than it should have been, especially at 19. The civilian, he said. The one without a name. I saw him leave. Yeah, he didn't look happy. No, she said. He didn't. Is that a problem? She thought about the closed file. About Nightglass and the 3 months and the mission record, and the things she'd said in the room that couldn't be unsaid. Probably, she said. I'll manage it. Hendricks nodded. He looked back at the window. Dietrich's looking for you, he said. He said to tell you the company is... He paused, searching for the phrasing. Assembled. His word. Assembled. She looked at him. "They want to see you," he said simply. They were at the vehicle staging area, not formal, not arranged, just the particular gathering that happens when people who have been through something together find themselves in the same space before the institutional machinery separates them into their component parts. Cole was there, arm in a proper sling now, the tourniquet replaced by something more considered. Trevino with his shoulder wrapped, talking to Martinez. Vasquez organizing his kit with the focused efficiency he never seemed to stop running. Dietrich was at the edge of the group, leaning against a vehicle, and when Mara came around the corner of the building, he was the first to see her. He didn't say anything, just straightened up and tilted his head toward the group in a gesture that was both an invitation and a notification. She moved to the group on the crutches. People made space without making a production of it. Nobody started talking immediately, which she appreciated. Cole spoke first. He was looking at the crutches. Vasquez said 2 weeks minimum, he said. Vasquez's timeline and my timeline may differ, she said. His is probably the one with medical backing. Probably. Cole smiled a short, genuine thing that cost him some dignity and didn't seem to care. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from behind the checkpoint wall with his broken arm, that specific professional recognition, but warmer now, the professional part having made its peace with something. 27, he said. It was the third time she'd heard it in the last 2 hours. It didn't get smaller with repetition. If anything, it was doing the opposite. 27, she said. Martinez raised the coffee cup he was holding, the same burnt institutional variety from the hallway, in a paper cup with a fold-down lid. Not a formal toast, just a gesture, brief and slightly awkward, the kind that happens when people want to mark something and don't have the right language for it. Several others raised cups or canteens or whatever was in their hands. Mara looked at the group, at the faces she'd been cataloging for 4 days and had spent the last 6 hours operating alongside. Dietrich's bitten lip finally still. Trevino's shoulder held carefully. Hendricks at the back of the group, hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression she recognized, because she'd worn something like it once herself, the look of a person who has seen something that changed the shape of what they thought was possible. She didn't give a speech. That wasn't what the moment was. She just raised the crutch handle, briefly, in return, and left it at that. Ward found her an hour later. She was in the equipment storage room they'd given her as temporary quarters, a small space, functional, with a cot and a locker and a single overhead light. She'd been sitting on the cot, looking at the rifle for 20 minutes. Not cleaning it, not breaking it down, just looking at it. It was laid across her knees the way it had been at the checkpoint wall after the tower fell. She was thinking about the thing Cole had said weeks ago that she was only now finishing the thought on. 7 years is a long time to be a ghost. Ward knocked on the open door frame. "You're not sleeping," he said. "No." He came in and leaned against the opposite wall. The room was small enough that they were 6 feet apart, which was about the maximum available. "The civilian," he said. "His name is Carver, in case you wanted to know." I didn't, but okay. He's been in touch with my brigade commander. The conversation, as relayed to me, was Ward paused, choosing the word terse. About me. About the rifle, the capabilities, the Nightglass connection, the debrief conversation. He crossed his arms. About what I put in my report. What did your brigade commander say? He said the report stood as submitted. Ward looked at her. He also said, and I'm quoting, that anyone who gets 27 people out of Blackstone Ridge is not a problem he intends to manage. She looked at the rifle. At the worn patch near the cheek rest, where 7 years had rubbed the finish thin. "That's not how Carver will see it," she said. "No, Carver will see it the way Carver sees things, which is through a framework that I don't have full visibility into and don't particularly want." Ward uncrossed his arms. "What I do have visibility into is what happens inside this brigade. And inside this brigade, Private Mara Voss is currently the subject of a commendation that will take her name to people who will want to do something with it. She looked up. I submitted it this morning, he said, before the debrief. She was quiet for a moment. You should have told me, she said. You would have tried to talk me out of it. Yes. That's why I didn't tell you. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who had thought about this decision and made it and was not looking to revisit it. Word Elias, he said. That was unexpected. She held it for a second. Elias, she said, the commendation is going to open things I've been keeping closed. I know. Carver, Nightglass, the mission record. I know. You're okay with that. I'm not okay with any of it, he said. I'm okay with you. There's a difference. He paused. The things that need to be opened should be opened. The mission record you mentioned, the target that wasn't who, they said that's not something that should stay in a drawer. She felt something shift. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in movies, with music and close-ups. Just a small internal movement, like a lock that had been stiff for a long time, catching and turning. It's going to be a long process, she said. Yeah, he said. It will. I might not come out of it in a position I recognize. Mara. He said it the way Dietrich had said it first name, direct, meaning something by the choice. You came out of Blackstone Ridge. Whatever's on the other side of this is probably manageable by comparison. She looked at the rifle for a long moment. Then she set it on the cot beside her, not across her knees anymore, just beside her. A small thing, the kind of small thing that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Okay, she said. 3 weeks later, a formal inquiry into a Nightglass operation, designated in records only by a file number, was opened by a military oversight body, whose name Mara had seen exactly once on paperwork she'd been asked to review. She gave a statement. 12 pages, specific, documented with the precision of someone who had been keeping records in her head for 3 years, because she'd known, somewhere, that this conversation was eventually going to happen. She gave dates, coordinates, target descriptions, the parameters she'd been given versus the parameters she'd observed. She described the 3-month departure process and the conversations that had occurred during it. She gave names. It was the most difficult thing she had done in a long time, which was significant given recent context. Carver did not contact her directly after the inquiry opened. 2 people she didn't recognize from an office. She wasn't given the name of, asked her 2 follow-up questions by secure phone, and she answered them. Then silenced the particular institutional silence that meant processes were moving in rooms she didn't have access to, at speeds she couldn't control, toward outcomes she could affect but not determine. She had done what she could do. She released the rest. The knee took 6 weeks, not 2. Vasquez's timeline had been optimistic, which she never told him because he'd been right about everything else. She spent the first 3 weeks at the FOB on modified duty, which meant administrative work she did with competence and zero enthusiasm, and the remaining weeks at a rehabilitation facility 200 kilometers away, where a physical therapist named Okafor told her twice a day that she was pushing too hard, and she agreed and kept pushing. Hendricks wrote to her, not a formal communication, an actual letter, handwritten, because he was apparently that kind of person, which continued to surprise her. He'd been reassigned to a different company for the next rotation. But he said he was studying for his specialty qualification exam. He said Dietrich had put him in for a merit recommendation. He said it psychologically, professionally. And this was the part she read twice, that he'd been thinking about what she'd said on the ridge, about ghosts being people who didn't make it, and that he thought he finally understood what she meant. She wrote back, shorter. She told him he'd done good work. She told him to take the specialist exam seriously and to stop carrying ammunition up ridges without being asked. She told him the merit recommendation was deserved. She did not tell him that his letter had been the first piece of personal mail she'd received in 14 months, or that she'd read it 3 times, or that it had done something specific and unexplainable to the thing she'd been carrying for 3 years. Some information was not relevant to the operational picture. Cole called her on week 4. The arm was healing. The bone had set cleanly. The prognosis was good. He expected full function within 6 months. He asked about the knee. She told him 6 weeks, and he said that was longer than he'd expected, which she did not respond to. He asked about the inquiry. She said it was ongoing. He was quiet for a moment, then said he'd heard things, the kind of things that move through military channels without being official, the informal current of information that flows between people who know the same people. He said the things he'd heard suggested that the mission record discrepancy was larger than just the one operation she'd described. She said she knew. He said he was sorry she'd been carrying that alone. She said she was less alone with it than she had been. He didn't push further, which was why she'd always respected him. 6 months after Blackstone Ridge, Mara Voss reported to Fort Redhaven. The orders had come through Ward, through the commendation, through the inquiry, through a series of conversations at levels she didn't attend, and a decision made by people she'd never meet. She'd been promoted, which she'd expected, and had complex feelings about. She'd been assigned to the Precision Warfare Instruction Program, which she had not expected and had different complex feelings about. She stood in the doorway of the instruction building on a Monday morning in October and looked at the range through the opposite window, long, flat, marked at distance intervals out to 1,000 meters, with the particular stillness of a space that hasn't been activated yet. 23 new recruits. She'd read their files on the drive in. Ages ranging from 19 to 26. Various backgrounds, various prior training levels, various reasons they'd ended up at a precision instruction program at Fort Redhaven. Some of them had been here a week already in orientation. Some had arrived yesterday. None of them knew anything about her yet. She was a name on an orders document and a rank on a door placard, and that was fine. She preferred starting from 0. The instruction sergeant, a heavy-set man named Briggs, with 15 years of range time and the patience of someone who had taught the same material to enough different people to understand that the material was not the hard part, met her at the door with a briefing packet and the expression of someone sizing up an unknown variable. "Sergeant Voss," he said. "Briggs," she said. He looked at the crutch. She was down to one left side, partial weight-bearing, more of a habit now than a necessity, though Okafor had said another 3 weeks before she could drop it entirely. "The range is yours," he said. "Recruits are assembled at 0800. I'll be there." He handed her the briefing packet. Started to turn away. Stopped. "Heard about Blackstone Ridge," he said without turning back. "Most of us have." She looked at him. "Just wanted you to know that," he said, and walked away. She was there at 755. The recruits were seated in the instruction room when she came in rows of chairs, an elevated front section with a whiteboard and a table, and the rifle laid across its case on the table surface, not assembled, just present. She'd put it there herself 20 minutes before they arrived. The rifle that shouldn't have been on a property book. The rifle with 2 worn initials near the cheek rest, laid open on the table like a question waiting to be asked. 23 people in 23 chairs. Some of them were looking at the rifle. Some were looking at her. Some were doing both in alternation with the nervous energy of people who don't know what register this room operates in yet. She set the single crutch against the wall. She could manage without it for a session. She decided this morning. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them for a moment, not performing authority, not establishing dominance, just looking, reading the room the way she read terrain, figuring out what she was working with. Then she said, "Precision isn't about pulling a trigger." She let it sit for a second. Anyone can pull a trigger. It requires about 4 pounds of pressure and no particular skill. What precision shooting is actually about is decision-making. You are deciding Every time you get behind that scope, whether this shot at this moment, with these conditions, is the right shot. She paused. Not the possible shot. The right one. A recruit in the second row, young, sharp-looking, sitting very straight in the way people do when they're trying to demonstrate they're taking something seriously, raised his hand. Go ahead, she said. How do you know the difference? Right versus possible. She looked at him. At the question. It was a better question than she'd expected on day one from someone who'd been in the program for a week. That's what the next 12 weeks are for, she said. And honestly, some of it you only learn after, which is the part nobody tells you going in, and which I'm telling you now so it doesn't come as a shock. The recruit, his name was Aldrich. She'd noted it from the files, looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating what they'd expected this room to be. Good. We're going to cover wind, she said. We're going to cover distance, elevation, humidity, temperature, ammunition selection, field improvisation, and what to do when three things go wrong at the same time and you're working with equipment that isn't what you trained on. She moved to the table, set one hand on the rifle case, not picking it up. And we're going to cover the part that doesn't show up in technical manuals, which is the part about living with what you do. Because if you do this work seriously for any length of time, that part will matter. The room was quiet. Questions before we start. A different recruit, older, female, with the look of someone who had been somewhere before this and was deciding how much to bring of that into the room. Yates from the file. 26. Prior infantry. The rifle on the table, Yates said. Is that the one from Yes? Mara said. Yates looked at it. Then at her. It's in rough shape. It works. I can see that. Yates paused. Why bring it here? Mara looked at the rifle, at the worn stock and the marked turret and the two letters that had been ground into the carbon fiber. So long ago, they were part of the texture of the thing now. Because it's mine, she said. And because the best thing I know how to do with the things that are mine is put them to use. She picked it up, held it at the balance point, not aimed, just held. It's been places I don't talk about in classrooms, she said. And it's been through a night I might talk about, eventually, when it's relevant to what we're doing. Right now it's here, because I want you to understand something on day one that took me years to figure out. She set it back down. The rifle is a tool. What you carry in here, she tapped her chest, is what determines what the tool does. She looked at the room. That's where the work actually lives. Everything else is physics. Ward came to Fort Redhaven in the third week. Not official, he was in the area on other business, which she suspected was not quite as incidental as he presented it, and he came to the range in the late afternoon when the recruits were running independent exercises and the light was going long and flat across the 1,000-meter targets. He stood beside her at the range control position and watched Aldrich work through a wind correction problem at 600 meters. Aldrich had turned out to be the most technically gifted of the group and the most impatient with his own errors, which was something she was working on with him specifically. How are they? Ward said. Unfinished, she said. That's appropriate at 3 weeks. How are you? She considered the question the way she'd been trying to consider things lately, honestly, without the reflex to reduce it to something manageable. Better, she said. Better as in better. She watched Aldrich make a scope adjustment. The inquiry produced things. I don't know exactly what happens next, but the record has been corrected. That's not nothing. No, Ward said. It's not. Carver is... She paused, reassigned. I was told that last week, without being told much else. What that means in practical terms, I don't know. Ward nodded. He looked at the range, at the recruits moving through their exercises with the visible effort of people learning a discipline that doesn't come naturally to anyone, regardless of aptitude. You're good at this, he said. The instruction. Briggs mentioned it. Briggs talks too much for a man who says very little. Ward smiled. She caught it in her peripheral vision. The convoy, she said. It came out without much preamble. She'd been deciding when to say it for 3 weeks. He looked at her. The one 3 years ago. She stopped, organized it. The inquiry found records I didn't know existed. After I left. About the convoy, about the network, about what happened. She paused. The connection I thought I'd established between the target I missed and the convoy, it wasn't what I thought. Ward was quiet. The network had multiple supply paths. The hit on the convoy was planned from a different element, using information that had nothing to do with the target I had in my scope. She kept her eyes on the range. It wasn't my 3 seconds. It was never my 3 seconds. The long afternoon light lay off meter across the snarto markers and the flat ground between them. Mara, I'm not telling you because I want something from it, she said. I'm telling you because you were in the room at Blackstone Ridge when I told Cole about it. And you've been carrying that on my behalf ever since without saying so, which I noticed and which I appreciate and which you don't have to keep doing. Ward was quiet for a long moment. How long have you known, he said. 3 weeks, the inquiry document. 3 weeks, and you're only telling me now. I needed to sit with it for a while. She watched Aldrich reposition behind the rifle. Some things need sitting with before they're ready to be said out loud. Ward nodded. She could feel him deciding something beside her. He was a deliberate person about certain things, measured in the way he moved from one position to the next, which was part of what made him good at the job he did. For what it's worth, he said, I never thought it was your 3 seconds. I thought you thought it was, which is a different problem and not mine to solve. She looked at him. He was still watching the range. It was never yours to carry alone, he said. That's the thing about Nightglass, about the way those units operate. They make people carry things in isolation and call it security. It's not security. It's just isolation. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Aldrich's shot hit at 580 meters. Wind had shifted while he was adjusting, and he hadn't compensated fully. She keyed the range intercom. Aldrich, wind flag at the 300-meter marker. Check your read before you adjust the scope. A pause. Then, copy. Sergeant. She released the intercom. Ward watched. He's good. He's impatient. Good comes after that gets fixed. It always does. He stayed until the afternoon exercise was complete and the recruits had cleared the range and filed back to the instruction building for the evening debrief. He shook her hand when he left, not formal, just the handshakes of two people who have been through something together and are acknowledging it without overstating it. Elias, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. For the commendation. For the report. For the room at the debrief. She paused. For going back for me. At Blackstone. He studied her face for a moment. 27 people, he said. I wasn't leaving one of them in the rubble. He left. She stood at the range control position for a while after, in the cooling late afternoon, watching the light go off the 1,000-meter markers in sequence from far to near as the sun moved. The range was quiet. The recruits were inside. The rifle was in the instruction room on its table where she'd left it. She thought about a question Aldrich had asked her in week 2 during a session on environmental reading out of nowhere, during a session on environmental, and slightly off topic, the kind of question young people ask when they're actually thinking rather than performing thinking. When you look through the scope, he'd said, what do you see first? She'd given him the technical answer. Wind indicators. Distance markers. Target profile. It was the true answer. It was also incomplete. What she saw first now, when she looked through the scope, what had changed between the woman who hesitated 3 seconds in a hide 3 years ago and the woman who stood on a deteriorating radio tower at Blackstone Ridge was not the target, was not the wind or the distance or the technical geometry of the problem. It was the space between, the space that had to be crossed carefully with honesty about what you were doing and why, before you made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She'd been learning to see that space clearly for 7 years and getting it wrong in different ways for most of them. She was still learning. She suspected she always would be. But she could see it now in a way she hadn't been able to before, and that was enough to work with. She went inside. The evening debrief was already underway, Briggs running the technical review while she'd been at the range. The recruits going through shot logs with the focused tedium of people building a foundation one brick at a time. She came in quietly and took a position at the side of the room, listening, watching the faces of 23 people at different stages of understanding the same thing. Yates was the last one to look up and notice her. She held Mara's gaze for a second, then looked back at her shot log. Aldrich was frowning at something in his notes. He'd figure it out. He had the stubbornness for it, even if he hadn't learned, yet that stubbornness needed patience as a co-pilot. The rifle was on the table, where it had been since morning. Mara looked at it. At the worn stock and the marked turret and the 2 initials and the 7 years and the 3 seconds and the tower falling and the 27 and the letter from Hendricks and the handshake from Ward and the inquiry document with the paragraph that had taken 3 years of weight off something in her chest. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She sat down with her recruits and got back to work. Because the hardest battle was never the one in front of you. It was learning to carry what the last one left behind and choosing every day what to do with the weight.